Hey there guys, Chris from the Volt Vlog. In this video we're talking about lithium-ion batteries for your e-bikes and how to extend the life of them. We want to get the most bang for a buck for these big, heavy, expensive batteries, and there are a couple of ways to do that. Let me just go ahead and throw this down and we'll jump right into the content. We've got temperature and we've got capacity that we want to pay attention to. We want to extend the life of our battery. So let's talk about temperature. So temperature, in my opinion, from the studies that I've read, have probably the biggest impact on the life of your battery. In a previous video, you can check the link for that. I'll put it up here. In a previous video, I mentioned you should get 800 to 1,000 cycles. If you don't know what that is, check out that video. And that should translate to 20 to 30,000 miles of usage for most riders and most e-bikes, okay? So temperature can take you well past that number, and it can actually take you well short of that number just by not paying attention to this here. And I think a lot of people run into the problem of treating their e-bike like a regular bike, which you can treat most of your e-bike like a regular bike, but not the battery. So if you're keeping your e-bike with the battery in your garage or in your backyard where it's getting very hot or very cold, you are killing that battery. And research shows that if you're spending any amount of time close to these extreme numbers here, these extreme temperatures, you can lose upwards of 40% of your battery's capacity in the first 3 months, guys, up to the first year. So within the first 3 months to 1 year, you can lose 40% of its usefulness just by keeping it in the wrong temperatures. So you want to make sure that you're keeping it in controlled environments, specifically for charging purposes. So when you're charging your battery, do not do it below 32 degrees and try to do it somewhere in the middle of this range. Probably close to the middle is the safest, best bet for most purposes. So don't go over 80 degrees Fahrenheit, don't go under 32 degrees environment. Keep it in a room that is very, very moderate in temperature, and you're going to do just fine. Same for discharging it. When you're using your bike, try to avoid using it consistently in these extreme temperatures. You can go below 0 degrees, you can go above 120 degrees, but you want to stay between these two numbers to ensure that you're going to get the long life from your battery that you can expect. And specifically even past that 1,000 cycle mark that I mentioned in the previous video. So 120 is pretty extreme. And just like I said up here, obviously the closer to the middle of this range that you spend your time in, the better. The battery is going to enjoy that. And then storage. Storage is critical here. A lot of people might ride their bike once a week or a couple of times a month and wheel it into their garage and leave it in their garage until they're ready to ride it next time, not realizing how cold it's getting in that garage or how hot it's getting in that garage. Just a couple of weeks in my garage during summer, that bike would be spending most of its time in 115 degree temperature throughout the day because it gets very, very hot where I live. The other thing to think about is for folks who have a folding bike. If you have a folding bike and you put it in your car and you drive around and do some errands throughout the day, especially during the summer, you have to think your bike's battery is spending a significant amount of time that day in extreme heat temperatures. So you want to store it for any extended period of time between these temperatures. From day to day, if it goes outside of that, no worries. But we're talking about extended storage, extended amount of time in these environments, daily periods. So maybe a week at a time or 2 weeks or 2 months at a time. Try to keep it in this range. The other thing to consider now is capacity. And one of these has an overlap, and that's storage. So storage, the ideal best way to store your battery is at 32 degrees or as close to 32 degrees as you can get, and at 40% charge. You don't want to store your battery when it's 100% charged. So if you're somebody who rides once a week and you tend to ride it and then charge it as soon as you're done, you take it up to 100% and then store it for the week, You don't want to do that. Taking it up to 100% and letting it sit for several days or several months is going to cause a significant degradation of that battery. And if you're storing it at extreme temperatures, you're really, really harming that battery. So you want to make sure you're storing it somewhere between 40 to 60%. That's going to ensure you have a nice long life out of your battery. So don't charge it at 100%. Don't charge it when it's too low. And that could potentially be the worst thing you do for your battery. If you store it for an extended amount of time so low that over the months that you're storing it, it actually drains itself completely down to zero, then in some situations, you are not going to be able to get that battery to function again. I see many bikes for sale, used e-bikes for sale, and the description says something like, got the bike, used it a couple of times, and it's pretty much sat in my garage all year. I can't get it to charge anymore, needs a new battery. And I think I know exactly why that's the case. Where I live, it gets very hot. It spent all summer in a garage, not being used. It drained itself all the way to dead. This thing's never powering back on, okay? So a battery that should have lasted years and years and years lasted just a few months because of those key things. So as long as we pay attention to those, you're gonna have a nice long life from your battery. So those are key. And I will say, those are the things you want to pay attention to. Pay attention to those and you're gonna be just fine. There are a couple of other things that you can consider, like make sure you're only using the charge controller that came with your battery or from the manufacturer that made your battery. You don't want to overcharge these things, make them charge too fast or too slow. You want to keep them at the rate that they're supposed to be charging at, and that's going to extend the life of your battery as well. These common practices are going to be wonderful for your batteries. But there is one kind of biggie that I think a lot of people debate over, and the research is there and the research is clear. There's no questioning that if you want to extend the life of your battery, and by that I mean add more cycles, how many times you can charge your battery and discharge it, if you want to add to that number, and what that translates to is more years of practical usage, then you want to pay attention to the usage capacity of your battery. And what that means is how much of your battery you actually use any given day. So I'm going to split this up into 4 chunks, and we're going to have a bit of a math lesson here. If you're not into math, I apologize, but we're going to split this up into percentages. Okay, so this would represent a battery that's filled up to here would be, it's 100% charged. If I fill it up halfway, it's 50% charged, okay? Now, the capacity would mean how much of the battery do I use each time I ride it. So if I fill it up to 100% and then I drain it all the way down to 0%, and I do that every single time I ride, or every single time I charge it, I charged it to 100 and then I used down to about 60%, and then I didn't charge it and I used it down to 25 and I didn't charge it, and then I used it all the way to 0 before I plugged it back in and took it up to 100. That would be using 100% of the capacity every time I charge it. It used to be, way back in the day when these first were hitting the market, it was recommended that you did that because people knew you only had a certain amount of cycles, and it was believed that by using all 100% of it each time you cycled it, you would get the most usage out of it. But that's not the case. We actually know, based on research and testing, that batteries that are used 100% every single time actually have the shortest lifespan. You get less cycles from a battery that way, at least a lithium-ion battery. So what research has showed is the smaller percentage you use, the more cycles you'll get. So in other words, let's say, because the research study that I read showed that if you use 50% of your battery, and by the way, what part of the battery's percentage you're using matters. So what does that mean? Well, the study that I showed said that the best possible scenario is to use 50%, which is this segment here, and this segment here, 25%, 25%, that's gonna give us the 50%. And you wanna use from the 75% charged zone to the 25% charged zone. If I use 50% of the battery from the 50 mark to the 0, that's not very good for the battery. And if I use 100% to 50 each day, that's not very good for the battery. We want to stay away from these extreme ends of the battery to get the longest life out of our battery. Or in other words, for the most amount of cycles, I want to stay away from the extreme ends. The research shows that 50% is the best for real world uses, even though using even less than 50% of the battery is going to give us more cycles. At least more cycles before the battery is no longer useful. It's going to start to degrade so much that you really can't practically use it for the same purposes that you used it before, okay? So it's not gonna be completely dead. It's just 1,000 cycles is the expected number for most of these batteries that you get for your bike, and that's 1,000 purposeful uses. You'll still be able to use your bike after 1,000 cycles. It's not just gonna die on you after that, but it's gonna become really unpleasant to use. You won't have the same energy output that you once had to really propel yourself with that motor. You won't get as many miles as you used to get. It'll start to get so small that it's just not worth charging it all the way up anymore. It takes too long for what you're actually getting. So by using less of the battery, all the way down to 10% of the battery, which the study that I read showed 75% to 65% was the absolute longest case scenario that you could get from a lithium-ion battery. So from 75% to 65% is going to ensure that you get around 9,000 cycles, useful uses of it. But here's the problem, and here's where I hope I can accurately explain this. So stick with me on this. Hopefully I can explain this well. If you're only using, I'm going to fill this portion in here, 10% of your battery, you can think of that as the percentage of you have 100 single percentile marks on that battery. Or in other words, you've got 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, all the way up to 100%. If I'm using 10% of the battery, I'm only using 10 units of that battery. 10 slices, 10 pieces of it. And if I can get 9,000 cycles of these 10 pieces, we call them energy units, EUs, that's only going to equal 90,000 energy units, okay? So even though it's going to give me 9,000 useful cycles, I'm only getting 90,000 energy units, which by the way, if your battery gives you 100 miles per charge, using 10% of your battery is only going to give you 10 miles of that 100-mile range. I don't know a lot of people that buy an e-bike that'll give them 100 miles range and say, yeah, I'm only ever going to use 10 miles of that 100-mile range. Or it would be like people buying a Tesla because they want that 300-mile range, but then only driving 30 miles of that range because they want to extend the life of that car. You would have saved a whole lot more money to just buy yourself a Nissan Leaf that'll travel the 30 miles for you, right? So it's not very practical, even though you'll extend the life of your battery, not very practical to do the 10% range because that's only going to give you 90,000 EUs. This 50% range from 75 to 25, the research shows that you're going to get at 50% range following that portion of your battery, you're going to get 150,000 energy units, because you're going to get around 3,000 useful cycles of that battery if you use 50% of your battery between 25 to 75%. So you're going to get a lot more life, real world life, out of your battery. So even though this is going to give you more years, in theory, of your battery usage, this one's going to give you more miles than years. So you'll get less years out of that battery, more miles. And the argument for this goes, what did you get your e-bike for? If you got an e-bike that'll take you 100 miles, but you only have a 5-mile commute to your office and back every single day, so 10 miles round trip every single day, then by all means, use this system here to extend that for years and years to come, but know that you actually are losing real world application or real energy output from that battery versus using 50% of the battery. You might get a shorter lifespan, but you're going to actually use more of the energy for the resources that it took to make that battery. So the mining and the energy that it took to build that battery and the energy that it takes to charge your battery, you're actually getting better results from that 50% mark, okay? And I apologize, I can see in the video that I went slightly out of frame here for you to see it, but 150,000 energy units is higher than the 90,000 energy units. Now, if you decided you wanted to use 60% of your battery's life, you could go from 20% to 80%, and that would knock you down to about, so this is 60%, that's actually out of frame, right? So I'm going to write it over here, 60% from the 20 to the 80, that's going to get you about 120,000 energy units, okay? Because you're using 60% of it and you're getting about 2,000 cycles in that scenario. At least that's what research shows. So 2,000 cycles at 60%, you're going to get 120,000 energy units. So it's, even though you can get more miles per ride, in the life of that battery, you're going to get less miles from that battery in real world application and usage. So the 50% mark, I'll just circle that, the 50% mark from 75 to 25% seems to be the best way to get the maximum amount of life out of your battery and at the same time maximize how much you actually get to use that battery, how many hours on your bike, how many miles on your bike it translates to. So it's controversial because there's a whole nother layer on top of that that says from time to time you should charge your battery all the way up to 100% because you want to make sure that you don't get any significant degradation on either end of your battery by never touching those parts of your battery. So it's said that, you know, every several rides or so, or every several charges or so, you want to take it up to 100%. Then it just becomes something that could be too much to keep track of for practical daily use for a lot of individuals. For many of us nerds out there, people like me, we like to pay attention to this kind of stuff. Maybe, just maybe, this is our cup of tea. This is what we enjoy, and we will go out of our way to do that. As nerdy as I am, not even I pay that much attention to it. I tend to charge my battery as needed, which tends to fall into about the 60% range for me. I'm using about 60% of my battery most days, and I'm not topping it off to 100 most days, just based on how my riding and charging cycle goes. So that's that scenario. If you were interested in that, you will be able to get lots and lots and lots of life out of your battery, plenty of miles out of your battery. You'll be able to enjoy this bike for years to come before you need to replace the battery. And that's a big deal for a lot of people because one of the most expensive parts, if not the most expensive part on the bike, is the lithium-ion batteries that we're packing on here. So hopefully that made enough sense for you to apply it and decide whether you want to take that on or not. But whether or not you want that crazy scenario, please, if you're looking to extend the life of your battery, pay attention to the temperatures, pay attention to your storage capacity, and you are going to be just fine. And you'll hit that 20, 30, 40, 50,000 mark on these batteries. At least that's the hope, barring any major complication, accident, wreck, fire, blow up, whatever could potentially come in and destroy these batteries, right? Life does happen, but in a perfect world, in a controlled environment, you should be able to get these numbers, and in the real world application, barring any major accident, you should be able to hit them. And if you have hit these numbers, you longtime e-bike riders out there, let me know, what's the most you've put in on a bike? How many miles have you gotten from one battery on your bike? I've heard, I saw somebody on YouTube a while ago, a few years ago, who mentioned they got 45,000 miles on one of their batteries, and that's kind of the highest that I've heard of. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to beat that one day, somehow, some way. We'll figure it out. But until the next video, guys, take care, and I'll see you around. Happy riding. Bye.